Hi, I'm Ron, and welcome again to PopSicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. So Halloween is just around the corner, and so I wanted to give you a treat that you can use for your D&D games. If you've ever played Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is one of the best video games ever, then you'd remember this. I'm sure you'd remember it because it just happens to be one of the most memorable Castlevania monsters, boss monsters ever. And in that video game, it was named Granfalloon. But in other versions of the video game where it appears in some form or another, it's also called Legion, which is of course one of the more popular terms for this demoniac creature. I've always been fascinated with this monster, particularly in how it was shown in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And so I've actually been thinking of how to transpose it into a D&D game, but I haven't seen anyone give the statistics for it. And so I decided, why not do it on my own, since I've been doing this for quite a long time anyway, and I do have a resource. I used the Dungeon Master's Guide recommendations or advice on how to create a monster for this particular one. I started with the CR that I imagined would be good for this particular monster, which was playing at 15 to 17, given that I wanted it to be epic, but not so epic that you'd need 4 level 20 characters to defeat it. So 15 to 17 was good enough, and then I made the necessary adjustments from there. So I'm sharing this with you now. There is a copy that you can download, and the link is down below. But let me guide you through it. So the Granfalloon is a gargantuan aberration. Why an aberration and not an undead or uh, a demon or a devil or something like that? Well, it strikes me as a very Lovecraftian monster that's coming from another realm altogether. At least that's how I interpret it. Although having the name Legion would probably denote a more demoniac origin. But, well, at least for me, I consider it more of an aberration, and so that's what I decided to do. But the alignment being chaotic evil, I think that's pretty clear. Here you see the statistics also, the ability scores of the Granfalloon. And you can see that it has very high scores in wisdom and charisma. I mean, something like that would have to have a very high charisma, right? Because it will draw all attention to it for sure. Not was not too sure about what to put in intelligence. I mean, you can totally imagine this to be a highly intelligent creature from another realm. But at the same time, you can also consider it to be just a mindless minion of Dracula in Castle Dracula. And so I didn't want to give it too high an intelligence score. So I settled for 13 just to, show that it's sentient and quite capable of making decisions, but it's not a hyper intelligent creature wherein you would wonder why it's allowing itself to be locked inside a room in Castle Dracula. The dexterity you might not agree with, however, I tried to balance it between having not too high a dexterity score that would be difficult to justify with that shell of corpses, but at the same time allows for a lot of flexibility to the core Granfalloon once it has lost its shell. Now I could have come up with 2 different dexterity scores from when its shell is still intact and when its shell has already been destroyed, but I think this is more straightforward, just giving it the same dexterity score. Anyway, you can imagine that the corpses are not really weighing the Granfalloon down. It's not as if they're really technically attached to the Granfalloon physically. It could be some telekinetic force that's bringing them together as a shell. I don't know if that justification makes sense, but with that in mind, then I don't think the corpse shell, or what I call the corpse shell, necessarily has to weigh or slow down the Granfalloon. Now you can see here the saving throws, the immunities, and resistances of the creature. I didn't take too much liberties with it. I could have put all sorts of immunities to it to make it a tough, very, very insanely tough creature, but I didn't want to make it like that. Um, I think the necrotic resistance makes sense, even if it's not undead, given its nature of decay and undeath surrounding it and its use of undead creatures. So it sort of makes sense for there to be a reduction in the damage caused by necrotic energy. Whereas with immunities, I'm pretty sure that you'd agree that it's not something that you can poison, and to give it a certain edge of level of difficulty, extra difficulty, then it also makes sense to make it immune to damage from non-magical weapons of all types. In terms of condition immunities, I can't imagine the Granfalloon as something that can be frightened, petrified, poisoned, or knocked prone, even if, particularly because it's a flying creature, and it probably has ways of keeping itself aloft instead of being dragged down to the ground, and that adds another level of difficulty to defeating the creature. Now let's go to its special features. The corpse shell is of course the most prominent one, and really what makes this interesting. I mean, if it didn't have that armor of corpses, it would just be a tentacled green creature flailing its tentacles around and shooting lasers, which probably has a charm all its own, but it's that corpse shell that really makes things interesting. So I spent some time really thinking about how to interpret that from a D&D perspective, a gaming perspective, and I was debating between giving it its own stats as if it were an independent monster that had to be defeated first, or just settling for making it an armored shell that has to be removed for you to gain access to the Granfalloon itself. And ultimately, I decided for the latter. It makes more sense for me. I have to admit, I'm not quite sure if I did it correctly. Like the number of hit points that I placed. For example, you can see here that I imagined it to have 200 hit points. My primary concern there is that given its CR rating, then that would mean that it would be a good fight for 4 level 17 characters, and by that time their damage output is insane, and so 200 hit points would probably take 3 rounds, maybe even less, for 4 characters to put down. And that's why it's important for the corpse shell to retain all of the immunities of the Granfalloon core itself, as long as that corpse shell is still attached telekinetically or whatever to the Granfalloon core. Of course, if you're a DM, you can play around with these statistics and make it even more difficult, add a few more immunities, or raise the number of hit points. But I think 200 is reasonable, given that the Granfalloon itself has 234 hit points, and a CR 17 creature normally wouldn't have too many more hit points than the sum of those. And anyway, as the corpse shell is slowly being depleted, the Granfalloon will have access to one of its attacks, which is that laser beam, which it isn't able to use as long as its corpse shell is intact. So that adds an extra dimension to it anyway. Now, as I said here in the description, the shell provides total cover when it's still at full 200 hit points, but once it's reduced to 150, or it has lost 1/4 of its quote-unquote hit points, then the cover will be reduced to 3/4 cover, and all of the implications of that, as you can see in the player's handbook. And then reducing the shell to 100 hit points will thus reduce the cover to half cover, and again, all of the implications of that. And finally, the Granfalloon will lose all benefits of cover once the corpse shell's hit points have been reduced to 25 or lower. So that's just a few remnant, corpses left, in which case it wouldn't really matter in terms of giving the Granfalloon cover. Okay? You will see later when we get to the actions when the Granfalloon will have access to its laser beam attack, or what I call the searing beam, because using the word laser doesn't sit well with me in such a medieval setting, which D&D usually has. Now, as you know from having played the game, whenever Alucard or Richter damages the shell, corpses fall to the ground and start standing and attacking your character. And so I wanted to duplicate this as well. And so what happens here, and you can see it here, it's called Rain of Corpses. Whenever the corpse shell incurs 10 or more damage from a single source, so it should be a single attack, whatever it is, whether it's a damaging spell or a melee attack or a ranged weapon attack, I should say, a certain number of the corpses will fall to the ground, fall prone, in an unoccupied space. Okay? So in this one, it won't attack directly the characters, but it will fall on an unoccupied space directly below the area of the Granfalloon space, which we know would be 4x4 squares at the very least, being a gargantuan creature. And these corpses will fall prone, but at the end of the Granfalloon's next turn, after that, they will begin to act. Okay? It's the DM's choice if they will attack the characters while crawling from prone, or if they will bother to stand. But what matters is they will start moving and attacking the characters at the end of the next turn of the Granfalloon. Now, for the sake of simplicity, instead of coming up with new statistics for these creatures, I think I thought it would make sense to just make them zombies, except that they would be like the minions of 4th Ed D&D, where a single hit would put them down. A successful hit would put them down because they have 1 hit point. Also, at this point now, unlike when they were still part of the corpse shell, these corpses can be turned as normal, except, again, that successfully turning these corpses will instantly destroy them. So they're very, very fragile. So they're just meant to overwhelm and also to distract, because instead of the characters being able to focus on the Granfalloon core itself, they will have to contend with these zombies which are trying to pummel them or grapple them even. Now let's go to the actions or the attacks that the Granfalloon can do. Now it can release corpses on purpose, which is something that the video game Granfalloon actually does also. So I call this the corpse drop, for lack of a better term at that point. Okay, so the Granfalloon on purpose drops 2d4 corpses less. Okay, again, you can tweak this, you can raise the number. Okay, at targets below its space, an equal number. So if, for example, you're in your roll, you get 7, as many as 7 characters, 7 player characters or NPCs can be attacked by this. It's not a weapon attack. It is something that you'd have to make a saving throw, particularly a dexterity DC 16 saving throw. And failure in that saving throw will merit 4 or 1d6 plus 1 bludgeoning damage, and then you will be knocked prone because essentially there's this corpse that has fallen on top of you, and also you are grappled. And the grapple has an escape DC of just 11, so it should be easy to escape from it, particularly a level 17 character. But again, it's a distraction. It's something that you'd have to do instead of being able to attack the Granfalloon directly. If the save is successful, the corpse will land on an unoccupied space adjacent to a character. And then, just like with the Rain of Corpse ability, they will start acting. Those corpses that just fell on an occupied space will begin moving or acting at the end of the next turn of the Granfalloon. And so while all of that is happening, as soon as the Granfalloon's cover is down to 3/4 from full, it will now be able to use its Searing Beam. And I was debating as to whether to make it a rechargeable ability, the way the Dragon's Breath is rechargeable at 5 or 6, roll in a 1d6. But I think CR17 justifies the limitless access of the Granfalloon to this particular ability, because aside from this weapon, the only other weapon it has is the Corpse Drop, which doesn't do a lot of damage. So, I made this a limitless ability that it can do every round, the Searing Beam, and it's a 90-foot line that is 5 feet wide, and each creature in that line must make a DC 19 dexterity saving throw, so quite high, quite fitting for a CR17 creature, and takes 12d10 or average of 66 radiant damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a successful one. And yes, that is comparable to the damage of an adult blue dragon with its lightning breath. Because, well, instead of coming up with an entirely new random amount of damage, I wanted to make it comparable to something that I could immediately access and understand. If you think that's not enough damage for the Granfalloon, then of course, as a DM, feel free to add more damage. Or if you think it's too much, then adjust accordingly. Now, the Granfalloon is definitely a legendary creature. It cannot be anything less than that, given that it's a boss monster. So it has legendary actions. Instead of coming up with entirely new ones, I just decided that it would be able to sweep the ground with its laser. And so one of the legendary actions is the sweep with a searing beam, which costs 2 actions. And instead of being a line, it's now a 60-foot cone, which gives it more area coverage, but has the same damage. I wasn't sure about whether or not to retain the damage or to lessen it a bit. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm keeping it right now as it is. Still 66 average or 12d10 radiant damage, but for potentially a greater number of characters. And then the other legendary action that it can take is a simple searing beam attack that it can use at the end of another creature's turn. And so that's the Granfalloon, or my interpretation of the Granfalloon, a classic monster from Castlevania Symphony of the Night. If I have time in the future, I will try to make statistics for other creatures in Castlevania, because Castlevania has some of the best monsters. Not only boss monsters, but regular monsters like the Medusa Head, which of course, I guess you can use some variation of the Varghul for that, by making it have a petrifying ability. But also the Fleaman, that monkey-like creature that likes jumping around, and any of those armored creatures in Symphony of the Night and other iterations of Castlevania would be very interesting to do statistics for, so that you can use them in D&D games. But here's this one, which is an epic monster. I hope you'll have fun playing around with it, and please give me feedback on my interpretation of the Granfalloon. If you liked what you saw and you would like to see more content that has to do with D&D and horror, and of course about popular culture in general and science and everything in between, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content. See you again soon!